I think we will maybe get Omar to just give a brief description of the story, and then perhaps read a short segment, if you'd like. And then Omar and I will talk a little bit about the story.
The story is called The Kingdom of Haymour, and it's about a man named Eddie Haymore who lives in Edmonton. He's 83 years old, and he looks like this nondescript elderly man, charming, nice elderly man. And the first thing that he will tell you is that in 1976 he took 30-some people hostage at the Canadian embassy in Beirut. So this is the story of that man. But now why he took the Canadian embassy hostage? Will we be talking about that a little bit? Well, basically he tried to develop an island, Ogopogo Island in BC, into a theme park, and the BC government conspired to thwart him and basically drove him mad with vengeance. And after he was institutionalized, he got out, and that's when he took the embassy hostage. But the amazing thing is that he won. He got amnesty. The Trudeau government gave him a ticket back. And 10 years later, he took the government to the Supreme Court and he won. Now, you would think the story would end there, but Eddie Haymore has mythologized himself for the last 25 years. And he truly, truly believes, he vowed once that children were going to learn about him in textbooks, but the opposite's happened. He's been completely forgotten. Part of that, I think, is just because the way that we view would view a Arab Muslim man walking into an embassy with machine guns to get justice has changed. We wouldn't view it as justice, I don't think. I think our first inclination is to view it as terrorism. So history hasn't been very kind to this man, and which has made, I think, his struggle. Has made it an even bigger struggle, I think, to become known in history. So Eddie came to me to tell his story about 6 years ago, and maybe I'll just read an excerpt from the story. In the underground parking lot of the Canadian Embassy in Beirut on February 23, 1976, Eddie Haymore, pointing with his AK-47, directed two of his cousins to the third floor, another cousin to halt the elevator, and another to follow him up to the second level. Haymore sprinted up the stairwell, charged through the steel doors, and pointed his weapon at the first person he saw, a senior citizen, presumably waiting for visa documents. "Stand up," Haymore told him. "Put your hands behind your back and put your face to the wall." The man remained seated, dumbfounded, until Haymore repeated himself in Arabic. The old man dropped to the floor, begging for God's mercy. When the embassy staff and clients arrived to investigate, they found assault rifles pointed at them. One employee, the trade commissioner, had met the lead gunman, Haymore, several times over the past 4 months to help him sell construction materials on behalf of a Canadian manufacturer. Or at least, that's what Haymore had told him. "Is this a joke?" the commissioner asked. Haymore then rocked him in the shoulders with the butt of his rifle. After picking himself up, the commissioner, along with approximately 20 diplomats, staffers, and stunned Canadian visitors, were hurriedly rushed to the stairwell and up to the third floor, where Haymore's cousins had captives of their own. There were 33 hostages in all, but the one that mattered most, the one Haymore wanted, the charge d'affaires to the Arab region, was missing. "Where's Sullivan?" Haymore asked the hostages. "He's not here," replied an assistant. "Bullshit!" yelled Haymore. "I saw him from my apartment." What the diplomatic staff were learning was that the wealthy Canadian businessman they'd been helping all along was a con man. They'd later learned that he'd spent most of the last 2 years behind bars and padded doors, and the last 6 weeks stalking charge d'affaires Alan William Sullivan from an apartment across the street. Haymore knew there was only one place Sullivan could be hiding. At first it appeared Sullivan's office was empty until Haymore noticed a leg under the desk. "Come out," he said, pulling Sullivan by the pant sleeve. The charge d'affaires crawled out on his hands and knees. Haymore directed him down the stairwell, through the hallway, and into a room where the other hostages were facing a wall. "If anyone has a weapon, throw it down, otherwise you'll be wiped out." No weapons were produced. Haymore lowered his gun, then turned to Sullivan. He softened his tone. "I didn't come here to hurt you, because if any of you get hurt, I'll be the first to lose. I came to ask for your help." He paused. "Here's my story."
It's a great story, obviously, when Omar and I first started talking about it. It was immediately captivating. A couple questions, Omar. Eddie in so many ways is such a larger-than-life character. But he's also a guy who, as you alluded to, really hasn't seen his life turn out the way that he thought it would or that he wanted to. So how did you, because you came to him, or he came to you, and the early part of your relationship with him was sort of a series of conversations that you knew that you would eventually probably try to tell his story in one format or another. How did you walk that line between objectively telling his story as a narrative journalist and feeding his desire to have his story told? Because really, all while not alienating what is really a sweet, but probably slightly deranged old guy.
Well, I mean, I think we all want to be the heroes of our own movie. We all want to be the heroes of our own stories. But he's taken this much, much further, where he's actually constantly pursuing people who are involved in the film industry to turn his life into a movie, and that's actually how we had met. I had a background in film, and I had a film column in a local newspaper, and he saw my face and he saw my name, and he said, "That's the guy who's going to write this movie about my life." And I was 21, 22. I was sleeping on my friend's couch after a night of partying, and my phone rang, and I answered it, and he said, "Is this Omar Mouallem?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "My name's Eddie Haymore, and in 1976 I took 36 people hostage at the Canadian Embassy in Beirut." And I thought, I've heard of you. Because he's kind of a bit of a folk hero in the Canadian Arab circles, and so I'd heard of him. I didn't recognize his name, but I'd heard about this man who had done this. So, and so we went out for coffee, and he was dressed to the nines, and he was extremely charming and flirtatious with the server. And the thing about Eddie was that he came to Canada in 1955, and he's still there. He's still this very debonair man, and so at first I was playing and I was feeding his need, and I was telling in my first few attempts to write this script that Ben Affleck was going to find irresistible. I was simply feeding his need, and being 22 years old, meeting this man who's lived the most incredible life I've ever heard of. I was just in awe, and he really was larger than life. And that was, I think, for a while, the story that I wanted to tell was his story. I wanted to sort of be sort of a vessel for his own personal narrative. And it wasn't until I talked to you, Curtis, and the first pitch that I sent you. By the way, I pitched Curtis probably 2.5 years ago. And we didn't agree on the story until a year ago, this month. And this is it. This is the anniversary. And I think and so yeah, I pitched you basically his story. And the thing about Curtis, the thing that he'll ask a writer again and again and again is why now? Curtis, you like this story, but the question was why now? Why are we telling this 40-year-old story now? And it took me a while to figure that out. And it wasn't until I was able to step out of Eddie's narrative and see not the man within the story, but the storyteller, and tell the story behind the story in a way. Why is this man so obsessed with me telling his story? And there was this moment where it all clicked in for me. I'd been holding on to a lot of Eddie's records and documents and stuff as I had been I guess, doing my research to pitch you, and I brought that back to his house, and he was putting it in this Tupperware box, and this Tupperware box is this man's life in this, 18 by 15-inch rubber box, and there was, pages from the outline of the script that I was going to write. There were pages from other people who had tried to write his screenplay. There was a novel in the works that he paid someone to work on. There was a chapbook of poems about him that he had hired a poet to write. There were these blueprints for these monuments that he wanted to build. I mean, and all of these were a monument or an attempt at a monument in a way, and none of them ever came to fruition. And the ones that he did manage to build, this, or at least get started, this theme park on the island was vanishing, or had vanished. And this castle that he had built in BC, this B&B, it was dilapidated and was actually run by the Hells Angels. At one point it became a grow-op. I mean, every time this man tried to put his mark on the planet, something greater than him came in and just erased it. And that's when I realized that's what the story was.
Is there, whenever I've written profiles, I worry is too strong a word, but I do worry about how the subject responds to the profile, because in some ways you have to walk a very delicate line, and you don't want them to like it, because then that means you probably sucked up to them. But you don't want them to hate it, because you don't want to be hated. I don't want to be hated. And so, I'm very curious how Eddie responded to it. Has he read it?
He has read it. He has it. We met for coffee last week, and I gave him a copy of the magazine, and I told him, let me know what you think of it. And usually with Eddie, he'll call me right away. I mean, I haven't heard from him in a week. I don't know what that means. But it is...
That was Omar's last feature for 18.
It's hard, right? Because he's, he knows his story so well. I've heard him tell it probably 10 times, and beat by beat, I know how it's going to unfold. I know the words to it before he even finishes them sometimes. There are moments where he chokes up on cue in telling that story. So for someone to now take that story from him and tell it in a way that he wouldn't tell it himself, or maybe in a way he doesn't see it himself.
Because he thought he owned it.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, do we own our own stories? I mean, do we actually have possession over over our own narratives and our legacies on this planet? Not quite. It's retold and reiterated by the people around us, our family, our friends, our enemies, and this man has enemies. His wife, his first wife. I think this is part of the reason why he became really, really desperate to tell his story in the early 2000s. Is after 9/11, his first wife published her memoir, and it was called "I Married a Terrorist." And it is not. It doesn't just paint a dangerous man. It paints outright almost an evil man in this book. And so he hasn't read it, but I had to pull things from this book to balance out his story as well. So the thing, though, I think I would have heard from him if he hated it. So
he said, hopefully.
Yeah.
I think what I would like to do is maybe hear a little bit more, and then so maybe Omar, if you could read one more very short segment.
So Eddie took the embassy hostage. He came back. He won the Supreme Court case, but he continued to obsess about his story. CBC at one point had optioned the rights to his story, but it never came to be because the second Intifada happened in Israel-Palestine, and it really colored the way that people seen him. And so he's kind of been forgotten in this world, except for one place, Peachland, BC. this community of fewer than 3,000 people, I think, and he's become a bit of an urban myth. So I went there in March and talked to people who had met him or just heard of him to kind of find out what his urban mythology is. Haymour's story still fascinates around Peachland to a degree, but the legend is beginning to warp and weave. I've heard rumors, a woman at the local tourism information center told me. I heard they found cameras in the castle. Well, not cameras, but peepholes. At the Blind Angler restaurant, a waitress told me that Haymour got put in jail for taking the Canadian consulate hostage in Iran. Her co-worker knew the name, that crazy guy who thought he owned Rattlesnake Island? It's like the story around the campfire, said Don Wilson, the museum interpreter. You know how when you tell it and it comes back to you, it doesn't bear any resemblance to the original story. It gets added to as it goes. Even those who know Haymour best acknowledge how difficult it is to tell where reality ends and fantasy takes over. Maybe a lot of people don't know how to put him in history books, said his son Lee. How do you? You've got a mix of Aladdin and Bin Laden. How do you write that down? And what's true and what's not? On my last day in Peachland, I set out for Rattlesnake Island in a rented boat with John Tuners, a local guide who frequently takes visitors across the lake on wine tours while relaying tales of the Ogopogo Lake Monster. As Tuners steered us closer to the island, it appeared smaller and smaller. Even from the boat, I could see that most of what stood on the island was wrecked or disposed of. I climbed out and onto the rocks where the dock, along with the pyramid, had long ago been shattered and removed by environmentalists. Chunks of cement remained broken in half with rebar sprouting like steel weeds. I could easily make out that nine-hole mini-golf course which was fractured by mounting earth, the cups so full of grass a golf ball wouldn't fall through them. A graffiti artist had bombed the enormous brick barbecue he'd built and tagged it, "Forget." As I walked around the island, a kind of sadness came over me. This had been a man's dream, conceived and constructed to represent and celebrate his life, his myth, his people, his ancestry, and now it was vanishing. I returned to the boat and stepped back in. I asked Tuners if he ever told tourists about the man who went to jail in a mental hospital and who had held the embassy hostage over the rights to this island. "Oh yes," he said brightly, "people love it." I thought this would please Eddie Haymore, the small sign that others also believed in the power of his story. As we puttered back across the lake, I asked Tuners to tell me the tale. It was brief and not particularly magical. And as we neared the shore, he finished. "And that," he said, turning off the boat engine, "is the story of Mr. Haley."